one of the ways that I've come to think about Hegel's own progressions, and I mean, it's very difficult to sort of uh, character, like, what does Hegel mean? I mean, when he's showing these, these various sort of, for instance, in the phenomenology, there's various forms of spirit unfold, forms of consciousness unfolding, or in the
Consciousness, yeah.
science of logic, showing these thought determinations unfolding. Like, what's the purpose behind that? I mean, it's certainly some kind of deduction. There's a methodological purpose to it that Hegel says, is the one true method. But one of the things that I think is important about it is that it sets in our mind the notion that on any sort of genuine philosophical journey, there are certain sort of nodes in the network, or there are certain sort of like clearings in the path that like one must encounter on the way, you know? And I think that that's sort of what Hegel sees as these various points. And I wonder if these thinkers are just, they're inescapable, because even if you begin from a position of pure inquiry, right, and you want to divorce yourself from all sort of tradition or anything like that, you end up thinking in a line with someone who's come before. Um, and I just, so where this is coming from for me, let me just sort of back up a little, or broaden the scope a little bit. I've been thinking a little bit about the fact that a lot of contemporary analytic philosopher, or the Pittsburgh Hegelians, are like, contemporary sort of pragmatists. They these people who are engaging with Hegel from this direction, they tend to talk about Hegel and in line with what they call the dissolution of philosophical problems. And this is the notion that, um, as I understand it, that it's the notion that there are certain mistakes that one can make philosophically, and that understand that what we need to recognize is that we're approaching, when we hit this problem, that we're approaching it from the wrong framework, and that we need to adjust our framework in order to understand the problem properly, and that once we adjust the framework, the problem disappears. And I tend to think that, Hegel talks about, he uses the word the absolute has a relation to absolution for him, right? Heidegger makes a big deal out of this in his lectures on Hegel. Um, and there, I think the idea is less that, we want to avoid making mistakes that other people have made, but it's more that we want to see that from a certain from the beginning of any genuine philosophical inquiry, these mistakes are inevitable, right? And these mistakes are going to arise. And what I think the point of like a Hegelian notion of the absolute is, a point of forgiveness, is an understanding that like what has come before, what one sees on this journey, one forgives oneself, because one is engaged in pure thinking, and um, these mistakes are bound to arise over the course of the journey.
That was so beautifully put, Doctor. Like, in fact, the book that I've really read by Hegel carefully is the Phenomenology. I haven't
Mm.
dared to look into the science of logic, and it's very clear. Like in the Phenomenology, it's this self-conscious. The dialectic unfolds through failure. Every stage fails, and
Right.
as you
That's
move on
what.
to the next stage, and then the thing is, you can't circumvent the failure. You need to go through the failure in some way to
That's
arrive
right.
at what he'd call absolute knowing, which is its
Mhm.
own kind of concept. Excellent, Doctor. I want to ask you this. So you mentioned, I'm glad you mentioned the Pittsburgh School, and certainly we're going to discuss them in detail in a bit. And he also mentioned history. And this question wasn't in the notes I sent you, but it's more something I've been thinking about really the past month, because this philosopher Christoph Scherenger wrote this really good
Oh.
book. I think that's how its surname is pronounced.
Hmm.
It's called A Social History of Analytic Philosophy. It's like a political critique of the analytic philosophy movement. And one point he makes in the book, it's a new book, so I don't even know if it's available at the moment. I got it pre-ordered, I believe. One point he makes is that this notion that analytic philosophers like to think philosophy is ahistorical, and they
Hmm.
kind of focus. Richard Rorty calls it the linguistic turn and whatnot. This idea that you could just through language analysis or pure ahistorical logic, one could do philosophy. So I'm curious for you, and again, maybe I'm characterizing them in a wrong way. I'm putting them all in this one giant camp, but just broadly speaking, um, as an Hegelian, if someone approaches thinking or philosophy that it can be done in like an ahistorical manner, how would you respond to that sort of MO or modus operandi?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's something that I've been really grappling with. I mean, my entire philosophical career, I've been sort of grappling with this notion that like there is a philosophy out there that thinks that it can divorce itself from history. Yeah, I mean, how does one engage with them? Well, I mean, it's hard to know. I mean, because there's a range of possible answers, and I mean, one is that like you know, there are some, I mean, one is the sort of like rhetorical response, right? Which is that like, I mean, there are some people who are so doggedly anti and like dogmatically anti-historical that nothing you say about the history of philosophy is going to uh, sway them. But I mean, it's even like, it's. I also think that on the other hand, I mean, people who tend to talk about a distinction between, the old Quinean distinction between those who do philosophy and those who do the history of philosophy is sort of a false dilemma. I mean, I don't really know anybody who, or I mean, maybe that when people talk about a divorce between philosophy and the history of philosophy, I wonder if the bark is often bigger than the bite, because the the fact is that even people who disavow historical figures, Wittgenstein, was famously, you know,
Famously,
right, loved to disavow the history of philosophy, and yet the philosophical investigations begins with a quote by Augustine. And so, I think that there's, people are always influenced by the history that they read, and whether or not how much they're willing to acknowledge it, I think is, the real question, right? And I have to say that, I mean, in my own sort of investigations, of course, I've always been, I mean, I'm more of a historian than a philosopher, I consider myself. And so I mean, of course, I'm very heavily invested in the history whenever I'm invested in philosophical problems. But I have to say that the philosophers that I tend to gravitate towards over time in the contemporary field are those who are really willing to take the history of philosophy seriously, and so I mean, people like the Pittsburgh Hegelians, who and especially Brandom has his own sort of unique relationship to the history of philosophy, but John McDowell is an excellent scholar of the history of philosophy, and an excellent reader of classical texts. And Christine Korsgaard is another one who I think is just an outstanding. I mean, takes the history of philosophy very seriously, and yet manages to make points of extreme contemporary relevance. I think there's a sense in which everybody is doing what Korsgaard does. It's just I feel as though Korsgaard is just a little bit more willing to admit it. So I mean, I guess that would be my response. Is I don't know that I I just don't know that, and maybe it's a controversial response, and I'm sure I'll see something in the comments to this where I'll be given some kind of counterexample or something like that. But it seems to me as though again, I mean, once people start philosophizing, the history of philosophy necessarily comes up. And again, because of the answer that I gave before, I feel like Hegelians have to be somewhat committed to that idea that there is that pure thinking itself, I mean, the course of pure thinking has a history that's unfolded in the course of any sort of individual's investigation.
indeed. I mean, there's a lot one could say here because obviously, like the analytic philosophers I've read most are like Quine, Kripke, Wittgenstein. And when you read them just empirically, it's very clear they're responding or they're partaking in an ongoing dialogue. So in
Right.
a way, they are a part of a historical project. But then
Mm-hmm.
also a more perhaps a philosophical point here is that when I interviewed Professor Adrian Johnston, the other Hegelian, he mentioned that there's this misnomer that in philosophy there are these people like who would be historians of philosophy, people like Frederick Beiser, who just
Mm-hmm.
does this like beautiful, very detailed analysis of a philosophical movement. And then there are the philosophers who are like coming up with new ideas. It's like that's a false dichotomy. There is,
Yeah,
in fact,
absolutely.
they're both philosophy, and one has to start from that point of acknowledging that truth. Well put, Dr. Wretzel. Well,